Welcome back to Altally Car, where we bring you the stories behind the stories, peeling back the curtain on global events and the forces that shape our world. If you want truth without noise, perspective without spin, and insights that connect the dots others leave scattered, you've come to the right place. The siege of Moscow has begun to starve Putin's war machine. That's not just a headline, it's a reality that military analysts, including retired U.S. General Ben Hodges, have been warning about. It is not about armies physically surrounding the Kremlin with tanks, but about the slow, grinding, suffocating siege of Russia's economy, logistics, and political will. It is about starving a war machine that depends on lifelines of fuel, ammunition, international trade, and domestic propaganda. So how does a country like Russia, historically hardened by centuries of war, reach a point where the word siege is even used? To understand this, let's rewind. When Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, the Kremlin assumed that Ukraine would collapse within days. But it didn't. Instead, Ukraine fought back, and drew on decades of underestimation to mount one of the most resilient defenses of modern history. Western nations stepped in with aid, weapons, and economic sanctions designed to bleed Moscow dry. At first, those sanctions seemed symbolic, dismissed by Putin as ineffective. Russia still had reserves, still had oil and gas to sell, still had buyers in China and India. But like a river that carves rock over centuries, the sanctions began to dig deeper, slowly but surely restricting the arteries that feed the Kremlin's war machine. Now, General Ben Hodges, former commander of U.S. Army Europe, is raising the alarm. The strategy to starve Moscow is entering a decisive phase. In his words, Russia's ability to sustain this war is cracking, not just militarily, but economically and socially. He describes it as a siege, not with catapults and walls, but with financial chokeholds, logistical blockades, and the erosion of Russian strength from within. Let's break this down. A siege in medieval times worked by surrounding a city, cutting off food, water, and supplies until defenders inside surrendered out of hunger and desperation. What's happening today mirrors that in principle. Russia's economy is being cut off from global finance, Western technology, and critical imports. Moscow can still buy and sell, yes, but it's doing so at a much higher cost, with fewer partners and with growing vulnerability. The oil and gas that once fueled Europe is now redirected to Asia, but pipelines don't move overnight. Infrastructure takes time, and while Europe pays less dependence on Russian energy, Moscow earns less profit. Starvation in a modern siege is measured in declining GDP, shortages of microchips for weapons, and the silent exodus of young professionals who no longer see a future under Putin's rule. But there's another dimension, the battlefield. Russia's war machine runs on ammunition, tanks, drones, and missiles. Ukraine, with Western support, is deliberately targeting supply depots, fuel storage, and logistics hubs. Every destroyed depot, every sabotaged railway, every cut supply line is another brick in the invisible wall of the siege around Moscow. Hodges emphasizes that this isn't about seizing land, this is about strangling the lifelines that keep the Russian army moving forward. And then there's morale. A siege isn't just about starving bodies, it's about starving minds. Inside Russia, propaganda is still powerful, but cracks are showing. The loss of soldiers, tens of thousands of young men, ripples through families and communities. The economy shrinks, and ordinary citizens feel the weight of war not just at the front, but in the supermarket, in the bank, in the empty shelves. Hodges warns that Putin knows this, which is why he doubles down, why he escalates with threats, why he leans on repression harder than ever. A leader under siege is most dangerous when cornered, and the world knows it. But history shows that siege warfare is less about sudden collapse and more about erosion over time. Take a moment to consider what Russia's war machine actually looks like in 2025. It is not just tanks and jets. It is a machine that relies on an interconnected system of fuel, steel, advanced electronics, and global access. Each part is now being starved. The West has weaponized patience, using time as its ally. Sanctions don't destroy overnight. They suffocate slowly, forcing Moscow to breathe thinner and thinner air. Ukraine understands this strategy. Rather than rushing headlong into battles that cost thousands of lives, it is systematically wearing down Russia's logistics. Strikes deep into occupied Crimea, attacks on the Black Sea Fleet, and sabotage inside Russian territory are not just tactical victories. They are part of the broader siege, cutting off Moscow from the resources it desperately needs. Ben Hodges draws a comparison to World War II. Germany wasn't defeated solely on the battlefield. It was strangled economically, its oil cut off, its factories bombed, its supply lines shattered. The siege of Moscow today, though less visible, follows the same principle. Without fuel, without supplies, without economic strength, the mightiest army becomes a hollow shell. So what does the future hold? The warning is stark. As the siege tightens, Putin will look for cracks to exploit. That could mean disinformation campaigns abroad, attempts to divide Western allies, or escalations designed to intimidate. The Kremlin thrives on the perception of strength, but the reality, as Hodges and others point out, is that Russia is weaker than it appears. The siege has begun, and it is working. Still, the story isn't about inevitability. A siege can take years. It can grind on, with both sides suffering, with innocent civilians paying the highest price. Ukraine's resilience comes at immense human cost, and Russia's collapse, if it comes, will not be a quiet fall. It will shake the region, perhaps the world. Yet the principle remains. Putin's war machine cannot operate without fuel, without money, without the lifelines that are now being cut off one by one. General Hodges' warning is not just military analysis. It is a message to the world that patience, pressure, and persistence can starve even the most brutal of war machines. It is a reminder that wars are not only fought with bullets, but with supply chains, with economics, with psychology. Imagine the Kremlin as a fortress. Outside, invisible forces tighten their grip. Inside, the machinery slows, the people grow weary, and the leader grows desperate. This is the siege of Moscow, not with tanks at the gates, but with the slow starvation of a war machine that thought it could never be broken. And here lies the paradox. Putin began this war believing he could starve Ukraine into submission, cut it off from energy, power, and international support. Instead, the tables have turned. It is Moscow that feels the tightening noose, and Ukraine, with its allies, that delivers the slow but steady siege. The world watches, and history waits. This is Altly Car, bringing you the stories others hesitate to tell. If you found value in this deep dive, stay with us, because the truth doesn't stop at headlines, and the siege, both literal and symbolic, will define the next chapter of this war.